Hear these words from the book of Exodus, chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. From the wilderness of Zin, the whole congregation of Israelites journeyed by stages as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water there for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" May these words be to us our light and our life. When I first started thinking about this sermon a few weeks ago, I had a vague sense of where I wanted to go with it. Enough of a sense to pick the hymns and write the call to worship, but beyond that, only half-formed ideas and inchoate thoughts. Still, it was something. And then, last Thursday, the man in the Oval Office announced his budget. And suddenly it was a good thing that I hadn't gotten very far, because I would have had to tear up the whole thing. I'm angry. I'm scared. I am tempted to despair. I suppose you could say that I am one of the crowd around Moses, wondering why the hell we left Egypt, only to end up in this desert, and we're thirsty, and look, Moses, we're dying here, and what are you going to do about it? And if you don't understand why they would want to go back to Egypt, ask yourself if in the last few months you've ever said you miss George W. Bush. One antidote to despair is a rant. And so, by golly, I launched into a grade A blue ribbon, top of the line rant. The unmitigated gall of the man to propose cuts to housing, education, labor, healthcare, science, agriculture, food programs, environmental programs, the arts, the humanities. The scale is so preposterous that you wonder if this isn't another smokescreen to hide some far more devastating attack on democracy. And then the Secretary of State openly talked about a preemptive military strike against North Korea. And a New York court revealed that he used an email alias for years to conceal Exxon's role in discrediting climate change. There you had it. One man implicated in two of the greatest threats to the planet, climate change and nuclear war, and another man threatening to, with the stroke of a budgetary pen, effectively wipe out life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for most Americans. In other words, as rants go, I was off to a great start. We live in an era of governance by tweet and Fox commentator. And don't get me started on greed-grabbing, climate-killing laws being proposed at the state level, including Minnesota, or the so-called federal health care overhaul, the baseless felony charge of wiretapping, the travel ban part 2, and did you remember to smile for the camera the last time you used your microwave? An awesome rant, right? And it only scratches the surface. But by this time, I had to choose between having a stroke or writing this sermon. I stand before you today, so you know what I chose. But that meant plunging back into this story about Moses and the people and the hardships that they endured in the desert. The people complain. It seems like they were always complaining. But for the first time since I was introduced to this story way back when, I was ready to cut the people some slack. Our translations tell us how frequently the people murmur or grumble or complain against Moses. But in my present mood, murmuring just seems like the second cousin to a rant. And I get that. To murmur to Moses or to launch into a rant means you're still fighting. And any time we're still fighting, the colossus of despair is shut out, door locked, move along, not the droids you're looking for. But shutting out despair is not enough. Like the ancient Israelites, we are thirsty and looking for whatever will sustain life in this geopolitical desert. Which led me to some Jewish commentaries on this text. The story that I just read from Exodus is also told in the book of Numbers, but it begins differently. In Numbers it reads, "They came to the wilderness of Zin, and the people stayed in Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there." And then it goes on immediately into, "Now there was no water for the congregation." Jewish scholars were struck by the fact that Miriam dies, and so in the very next verse does the source of water. As my rabbi friend Brad Artson explains, the juxtaposition of these two events became the foundation for the legend of Miriam's well, an abundant supply of fresh water that followed Miriam and was accessible to her and the people as they wandered throughout the desert. So long as she lived, there was a well, a fountain of living water that sustained them. When she died, the well dried up. Now what? That's what happens in the story that I read. In our Exodus stories, our lectionary readings focus on the leadership of Moses. But the Jewish commentaries are clear that it's a triumvirate: Moses, his brother Aaron, and their sister Miriam. Each of these leaders brings something essential to the wilderness experience that enables the people to survive. Through Aaron, God supplies the pillar of cloud. Through Moses, God supplies food, the manna that appears every morning to nourish the people. And through Miriam, God provides water. As each sibling dies, the sustaining power of each gift is transferred to Moses. Even as you might say, Moses will ultimately transfer the life-saving gift of the Torah to the people. You can find in the Bible descriptions of the pillar of cloud and the gift of manna, but there are only hints for Miriam's well. And so the Jewish scholars had to elaborate to fill it in. An 11th century rabbi described it like this: Miriam's well is a wondrous well that flows from itself like a rock full of holes. Let's say that again. A wondrous well that flows from itself like a rock full of holes. And this sieve-like rock is movable. It follows Miriam like a rolling stone from one place to another. When she dies, God shifts access to this rock from her to Moses so that the well rock continues to provide water for the people. But as the story makes clear, God is the source, the aquifer, if you will. Moses is the intermediary, and the water flows for all. Everyone drinks. I love that image of a rolling well. A movable source of living water that follows us into all the bleak places that our feet or our historical circumstances carry us. Is the Lord among us or not? The people asked, and then they drank the truth from the well that yes, God was with them. It's a valid question. Is God with us or not? In these thirsty and rant-filled days, faith in God's presence can slip from our grasp. I mean, we can speak affirmatively still of that broader sweep of history, that long arc of justice that Martin Luther King talked about. Yeah, in that long, broad stroke, God is with us. But does that hold for the very particular and the very personal? Right now, in this moment, is God with us? As we are overtaken by one event after another, is God still with us? And what does that look like when one lie after another comes out of Washington, as one agency after another falls under the control of its sworn enemy, as the planet itself bears witness with the people to the depredations of the ruling powers? Is God still with us? What does that look like as we deal too with the more personal issues that fill our days, as we struggle with our own health or that of loved ones, as we deal with loss, with change, with uncertainty? Where is that rolling well, that source of living water? Try out this idea. God is the source, right? And the human body is, what, about 60% water? And the well is moving. In other words, we can think of ourselves as walking wells. Each of us drawing water from the deep aquifer of God that flows from beneath us, through us, and around us. Walking wells, drawing water from the deep aquifer of God. That water is also flowing from us, like a rock filled with holes, so that we can help sustain others. And if one of us falters, then access to that living rock shifts to another, and we all drink. Even as we are upheld by the living waters of God, which we know from the words and teachings of Jesus, the prophets, and the apostles, we hold up one another. We drink from the fountain in our worship and in our witness and in those spiritual practices that lead us inward for acts of renewal and outward again for acts of resistance, but always forward in community. We drink truth from the well of God's teaching and remind each other that God is among us. Look, we know that life was hard for the Israelites in the desert and that it lasted a long time. There's no denying or glossing over that. But we also know this to be true. In all of their journeying, the people were led by the Spirit of God, and no matter how hard things get for us, so are we. There are still days when I am afraid. There are many days when I am angry. There are days when I feel like I am being stalked by despair. And then I take a drink of water. Is God with us? Yes. Is God with us? Yes. Is God with us? Yes. Amen to that.